Good morning and welcome to this workshop on AI and judgment. My name's John Tsulis. I'm the director of the Institute for Ethics and AI. It's great to see so many people attending this event. The great German philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote that the power of judgment is a special talent or a peculiar talent. And without venturing too far into the dangerous minefield of Kantian exegesis, one way of taking this claim is that judgment is a power that's difficult to pin down, that it's somehow elusive, that judgment does not, for example, simply consist in the straightforward the application of rules. Hence, Kant thought it's not really straightforwardly teachable. There are no PhDs in judgment as opposed to about judgment. Another way of taking special or peculiar, however, is that judgment is a power unique to human beings, at least within the natural order we inhabit. Indeed, for many, the power of judgment is integral to the special dignity that inheres in human beings. Unlike other creatures known to us, humans have a distinctive power to reach theoretical and practical judgments after due regard for salient considerations and to take responsibility for those judgments. And it might be thought that the two senses of special or peculiar operate as a tag team. The elusiveness of the notion of judgment helps us preserve the special dignity of human beings because we can always credibly say, regarding any potential competitor for that special status, that they don't really possess the power of judgment in the relevant sense. We redraw the boundaries of human dignity, as it were. Now, this entire situation is being transformed by increasingly sophisticated AI-driven technology based on new forms of machine learning. Although AI decision-making systems don't operate in anything like the way humans do, spectacular claims have been made about their ability to generate judgments in domains from law to medicine, management, and beyond, judgments that are as good or better than those of humans, as well as being produced faster and more cheaply. Now, about this competition between human and artificial intelligence, the psychologist Daniel Kahneman has written, "Clearly, AI is going to win. It's not even close." The implications for human dignity, among other ethical ideals, is a problem that he says he is happy to leave for his grandchildren. Now, part of the problem here is, or part of the background here, is Kahneman's firm conviction, elaborated in the co-authored book Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment, the subtitle, that algorithmic methods, whether they're embodied in AI or not, are practically always superior to the exercise of human judgment, with its susceptibility to bias and to what he calls noise, unwanted variability, among other defects. Now, in this workshop, we're going to explore from different angles the relationship between human judgment and artificial intelligence. To what extent does AI promise to assist human judgment? To what extent does it threaten to subvert it? And to what extent is it appropriate to replace human judgment with AI? And we're delighted that a truly stellar group of speakers has answered our call. As befits an institute within the humanities, we're going to start with some philosophical and historical groundwork. With Onora O'Neill, the contemporary moral philosopher who has written most deeply and acutely about judgment, with Lorraine Daston, whose recent book, Rules, A Short History of What We Live By, gives a brilliant account of how historically the concept of a rule incorporated a plurality of ideas, and which traces the process, how over time, one specific conception of rules, conceived as algorithms, has become ascendant, thereby also legitimizing and marginalizing the exercise of human judgment. But in addition to the philosophical and historical background, we believe that the issue of judgment in its interaction with AI has to be examined in a context-specific and comparative way by looking at and comparing different domains of human decision-making. And that's because these domains are structured by distinctive constellations of values which have varying implications for the role that human judgment can play within them. So for an example, in a world obsessed with outcomes, it's all too easy to believe that we should simply care about the correctness and consistency of judgments, in addition to the efficiency of the processes that lead to them. But in some domains, there are seemingly deeper values at play, which concern not the content of judgments, but the process through which they're generated. When being sentenced by a judge, it's reasonable to demand not only a just sentence, but one whose rationale can be grasped by the accused. It's reasonable to demand that the sentence be handed down by an agent who can take moral responsibility for something so drastic as conveying communal censure through the deprivation of liberty. These considerations may not be in play or not in play in the same way or with the same force when the domain of judgment is cancer diagnosis or hiring decisions in a firm. So I'm delighted that we have distinguished speakers from the world of clinical medicine, Fergus Gleeson, law, Lord Neuberger, and music, Georgina Bourne, and also, of course, a brilliant interdisciplinary array of commentators, many with expertise in the scientific side of AI to keep us on the straight and narrow. Another great German philosopher, Friedrich Schiller, said that man is only fully a human being when he plays. So we're going to conclude in this spirit with an invitation to everyone to actually exercise their own judgment as Professor Barry Smith leads us through a wine tasting in which human judgment is pitted against AI in evaluating wines. So I'm going to pass on now to our first panel, chaired by my colleague Carissa Veliz.
Thank you so much, John. And thanks everyone for being here. It's my pleasure to chair this panel. Our main speaker is Baroness Onora O'Neill, who hardly needs an introduction. She's an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Cambridge, a member of the House of Lords, and former president of the British Academy, among many other honours. She has written widely on political philosophy and ethics, international justice, bioethics, and the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. She has earned numerous honors and awards for her work, including the prestigious Berggren Prize, which is considered something of a Nobel Prize for philosophy. She is the author of more than a dozen books. Her latest one, published last year with Cambridge University Press, is titled A Philosopher Looks at Digital Communication. Baroness Onora O'Neill will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we have two amazing commentators. Thank you so much, all of the speakers, commentators, for being here. First, Alison Hills will comment for about 5 minutes. She is Professor of Philosophy, Fellow and Tutor in Philosophy at St. John's College here in Oxford. Her research is in moral philosophy. She wrote her PhD thesis at Cambridge on whether Kant shows that we have reason to be moral. She has also written on metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. Her most recent book, The Beloved Self, published by Oxford University Press, addresses the conflict between egoism and morality, and whether we can justify claims that we have reasons to be moral. And then Sir Nigel Shadbolt will also comment. He's principal of Jesus College and professorial research fellow in computer science here at Oxford. He's also chairman and co-founder of the Open Data Institute. His research in AI touches a broad array of topics, including natural language understanding and robotics, expert systems, computational neuroscience, memory, semantic web, and linked data. But he also writes on the wider implication of his research. And one example of that is his latest book called The Digital Ape: How to Live in Peace with Smart Machines. Thank you all for being here. And without further ado, the floor is yours, Baroness Onora O'Neill.
Well, I'm very honored to have been asked to speak because I think I must know less about AI in its technical details than almost everybody in the room. However, judgment is something I have thought about a bit, and I'm going to start there. John's already referred to the recent book by Kahneman, Sibony, and Sunstein called Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. It's a rather presumptuous title, but there we are. Published in 2021. Complex, fascinating, and I'm just not convinced that they've identified a flaw, let alone the flaw in human judgment. The supposed flaw that interests them is not that some judgments are biased, although this is true, and it can be troubling, indeed unacceptable, and it receives a lot of attention. Their concentration is on the fact that a lot of judgment is what they call noisy. That's to say that judgments made about one and the same case can vary. Indeed, they could vary hugely. We all know that. An evident result is that a large amount of disagreement between judgments about one and the same matter is ubiquitous. though one has to say more in some areas than in others. Now, judgment is indeed underdetermined. I don't think any of us would disagree about that. And judgments made in and about a given situation therefore vary. But why is this a flaw? Well, I think we can see some practical reasons why it's a difficulty. But we do expect judgments to vary. Theoretical judgment of one and the same situation may vary for many different reasons. So can practical judgments about what to do in a specific context. And although too much variability in certain sorts of judgment can be a problem, variability is surely, let me put it this way, a feature, not a flaw of human judgment. While a method that selects a determinate view of a situation in which action might be taken, in some cases it may not be feasible or plausible to resolve indeterminacy or to identify a single way of resolving it. The thought behind the claim that human judgment has a deep flaw seems to me to be that judgment is either sometimes or often too variable to be reliable, or may more variable than we think acceptable. This may be true, but in many cases variability is exactly what we expect and what people have in mind when they comment, when they say every day it's a matter of judgment. How to address this? One thought that occurred to me is that one could do it by examining judgment in different areas. Judgment by judges, judgment by referees, judgment by craftsmen and craftswomen, judgment by art historians, judgment in everyday life. Is the level of indeterminacy typical of judgment of various sorts variable? If so, why is it much greater in some areas than in others? However, I've not gone in this direction for several quite sound reasons. First, it invites, indeed it requires, comment on a very large range of cases. Secondly, comment on many of these would need an expert or alternatively a sociological approach, which I lack the relevant expertise to undertake. Third, many of those who need to exercise judgment make judgments of more than one sort, all of us, by the way. Consider judges, however, for a technical example. Judging whether a guilty verdict is justified in a particular case is different from judging what sentence should be imposed once the verdict is established. It seems to me unlikely that case studies of judgment are going to give us a complete picture. So I think it may be more plausible to try to work out which broad types of judgment are relevant for which purposes. And here, you may not be surprised, I'm going to draw on some of Immanuel Kant's late writings on judgment. I begin by noting that Kant argued that rules are always or often incomplete, so underdetermine their uses and applications. He discusses judgment in many different works, mostly late works, Critique of Judgment, Theory of Practice, many others, and his later writing often distinguishes theoretical judgment, which he divides into what he calls reflective and determinant or determining judgment, and practical judgment, which he divides into technical and ethical judgment. It's all a bit more chaotic than that makes it sound. These types of judgment are distinctive, and each can be found in a wide range of different types of inquiry or activity. As Kant sees it, determinant or determining judgment focuses on particular cases and asks whether or not they fall under some, his generic term here is universal. Quote, "The power of judgment in general is the faculty of the thinking of the particular as contained under the universal. If the universal, that is, the rule, the principle, the law is given, then the power of judgment, which subsumes the particular under it, is determining." That's just the definition of determining. judgment. But in other cases, judgment is not determining and does not seek to subsume a case under a universal concept, rule, principle, law. As he puts it, as follows: if, however, only the particular is given, for which the universal is to be found, then the power of judgment is merely reflecting or reflective. In reflective judgment, we start with a case, but without assuming or accepting that a specific rule, concept, principle, or law is going to be relevant. Determined and reflective judgment both assume that there's something to be judged, a particular case, an aspect of the world. The difference is that in the former, the task is to judge whether that case or particular falls under some specified concept, rule, principle, or law. In the latter, the task is to find some concept. Very different tasks. What one's looking for is a concept, rule, principle, or law under which the case can fit, or in some cases to find some concept, rule, principle, or law under which the case not merely fits, but fits rather well, or fits better or more appropriately than it does under certain alternative concepts, rules, principles, or laws. The difference is illustrated, to take a very simple example, by the contrast between asking, is this bird a robin? Simple, determinate judgment, which permits, indeed invites, a judgment that provides a yes-no answer. Yes, it is a robin. No, it is not a robin. And contrast that with answering the question, what sort of a bird is this? Which requires more, where a yes-no answer just won't work. If you ask, what sort of a bird is this, and someone says to you, yes, they probably didn't hear you. It seems to me that determined judging can be algorithmic provided certain conditions are met, although spelling out those conditions would take a lot, but that reflective judging cannot. Practical judgment differs from both determinant and reflective judgment because it doesn't start with a case or item to be judged. Here the task is to enact some principle, I say that word again, enact, some principle or standard, or to shape some, typically very small, aspect of the world, so that it fits a certain specification, again, a concept, principle, rule, or law. No given particular is identified as the item that has to be judged. Practical judgment it differs from both determined and reflective judgment, and Kant points out that practical judgments can be technical or moral. His examples of technical judgment are often taken from either farming or ballistics. I'm not quite sure why those are the two fields, but it clearly gives you a wide range of possibility. Neither sort of practical judgment, whether it's moral or technical, is a matter of judging an existing situation or case, or indeed a future situation or case. We can't work out what is required or what ought to be done or what ought not to be done by discerning or considering which type of act an agent will have done at some future point. Nor is practical judgment a matter of prediction. Practical judgment, including moral judgment, relies on normative principles or standards. Some of them are ethical, some of them are what Kant calls technical, we might say instrumental, which are deployed on the basis of some understanding of a situation or context of action. That understanding will build on judgments, both determinate and reflective, both about the situations faced, and those judgments about situations are not future-oriented in the way that technical and ethical judgment are both future-oriented. So, back to algorithms and practical judgment. How might these very commonplace comments be relevant to considering the role or the roles of algorithms in judgment? This is what we shall be discussing today for many hours, And I think that algorithms may be useful in making at least some determinate judgments. You notice how cautious I'm being there. At least some determinate judgments. However, both reflective and practical judgment are different. And I shall say relatively little here about reflective judging. And my main focus will be on reasons why algorithms are unlikely to be useful for most sorts of practical judgment. I think this is more readily set, actually, they may give, so to speak, parallel approaches. I think this is more readily set out by considering why practical judgments present distinctive challenges to us in everyday life. The context of practical judgment is, as I noted, not set by a particular case that is to be judged, but by the situation in which action is to be taken to shape an aspect of the future world to ensure that, if possible, it meets certain norms or standards. Evidently, this is extremely difficult, even where the focus is on living up to a single and clear norm and standard, never mind where you are trying to satisfy a diversity of norms and standards, as we often are. However, the difficulty of practical judgment is much greater where agents aim to or are required to live up to a plurality of norms and standards that conflict with one another in actual circumstances. In some cases, such a conflict takes the form of a moral dilemma. An agent who aims to be honest and kind may find that in the actual situation which he faces, speaking the truth would be unkind, but acting kindly would require some, or perhaps a lot, of deception and dishonesty. In other situations, and quite a lot of them, I think, loyalty to friends and family may conflict with obedience to law, while keeping promises to one person may breach undertakings to another. These practical conflicts are ubiquitous. I mean, you may say the absolute stuff of life and literature. In other situations, loyalty to friends and family can conflict with obedience to law, but keeping promises to one person may breach undertakings to another. These sorts of dilemmas are very familiar. We speak of them as dilemmas, and of those in which there are conflicting ethical demands as moral dilemmas. Moral dilemmas, I think, are not rare. They're all too common, although we often look away. In other situations, conflict arises not between moral requirements, but between other practical requirements and aims. I may want to go shopping and to go swimming on Sunday morning, but I might find that I cannot, in the time available, fit both in. I may want to go on an exotic holiday and to give generously to my favourite charity, but I find that I cannot afford both. I may seek to qualify as an accountant and to travel the world, but find that these ambitions cannot be fulfilled at the same time. Some ordinary dilemmas can be resolved by time management. That's perfectly true. But many cannot, and agents must then subordinate one aim to another, or indeed, alternatively, set both aside. Underlying these well-known difficulties, there's a broader problem. Norms and standards propose or prescribe specific types of action, but they don't offer reasons for selecting one rather than another particular act that meets those requirements. The reasons we can find for action in a given situation will underdetermine what's done. Does this matter? As I see it, this reality can't be eliminated. There will always be aspects of action taken that could have been done differently, and not every difference will be better or worse. Or certainly not obviously better or worse. Agents who respect the various technical and ethical considerations that are relevant in some actual situation don't fail in any way, and also would not have failed if they had acted in some other way that also respects the various relevant technical and ethical standards. We expect practical judgment to vary, and do not fault what's done, provided it respects the relevant technical and ethical standards. There may also be some cases in which a few breaches of what are generally seen as required technical standards are seen as acceptable, even admirable in the specific circumstances. I think of things like offending against rules of grammar or prosody to create a certain effect when you're writing. It therefore seems to me clear that technical and ethical judgments are going to be unavoidably variable, and that we do not fault them for this reason. It's not a flaw, but just a feature of such judgments that they do not eliminate indeterminacy. Back for a moment to theoretical judgment, and then I will stop. Should we reach a different conclusion about theoretical judgments? Are determinant and reflective judging better if they entirely eliminate indeterminacy? Seems to me that the answer to such a question is difficult, but the seeking or demanding fully determinate theoretical judgment is also implausible except in some specific cases. For example, some judgments made in measuring the physical properties of a material object, the height of a tree, the weight of a pumpkin, are better if they are accurate. That we can agree on. Yet we do not expect even these judgments to be accurate to an indefinite number, or even to a very large number of decimal points. Not generally. Where we can expect judgments to be fully determinate is surely where they are supported by the scaffolding of a formal system, for example, an arithmetic calculation, which will provide a complete basis for reaching a determinate answer. A puzzle will contain sufficient information or clues to work out the answer, but for the most part, I suggest indeterminacy is not a flaw, it's just an ineliminable feature of judgment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fantastic talk and for staying right on time. And now we're going to hear from Alison Hills.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and inviting me. And thank you very much, Onora, for that very interesting talk. So I want to address my comments very much to what Onora was talking about and draw some further some questions, really, from particularly what she was talking about practical judgment. So I'm very sympathetic to the view she's put across, but I am also perhaps a little bit more concerned about it than she is. So I want to address, bring out some questions that I think this sort of view would need to address. So philosophical questions, particularly about what judgment is. So what I take Onora to her main claims here about practical judgment is that it is in its nature various. This is a feature of our practical judgment and not a flaw. And practical judgments are various because there are different ways of meeting a number of principles. And when you do that, it's not the case that there are always better or worse ways of doing that. So she said there can be differences without those differences being a sign that someone's made a mistake or someone else has made a better or worse judgment. And even when there's one principle, there may be different ways of implementing it, and likewise, they might not be better or worse. Some of the examples she gave were particularly in moral philosophy about moral dilemmas. So, for instance, there may be, you may want to be honest and kind, and those might come into conflict, but there may be more than one way of resolving that conflict, and it's not the case that one way is better or worse than the other. So I said, this seems to me a very attractive, appealing kind of view. I think Onora's focus in this talk was about whether that shows there's a sort of unreliability or a mistake in those judgments, and I agree that it doesn't. I do want to just point out, and I don't think she would disagree with this, it's with some of the comments she made but didn't really talk about much, is that there might be some practical reasons for wanting convergence in practical judgment. So for your own practical judgments, you might want to be consistent through time. So you want to make the same sort of judgments in different cases. And that's a pressure towards converging on making the same way, say, of honesty versus kindness through time. When we think about making decisions with other people, because of course ethics is about how we deal with other people, there may be even more pressure towards making the same sorts of decisions, because we have to coordinate together, we have to predict what other people are going to do. So we need to have some sense of at least what the limits are of what they might make, and perhaps more than that, convergence in decisions. We need to explain and justify decisions to other people. And we need to find actions that are acceptable not just to myself. So often when I'm making a decision in these sorts of cases, I want an action not just that seems right to me, but that other people is going to seem right to other people. Now, it might be that we converge on a range of actions that we take to be acceptable, and then within that range, there's variation that's acceptable. But there will be problems if we can't agree on the range of acceptable actions. So Onora makes a decision for honesty where I think that was too honest and it turned out to be unkind. Sorry, of course she would never do that. So there may still be difficulties with if there's too much variation. Okay. But the second kind of points I want to make, I think are more fundamental, and they're about how should we think of this practical judgment that both Onora and I think exists. How should we understand what it is? And I think this is a bit more problematic and more difficult to say than it might first appear, and several of the ways of making it more precise are not acceptable, and it's not quite clear what the right thing to say is. So I want to say a bit more about that. So we said that practical judgments can be different, but not better or worse from one another. And one way of seeing that is that there aren't reasons to choose one over the other. Reasons sort of give out at this point. One way of understanding that is modelling it by a kind of choice where the reasons are exactly equal to one another. There's literature in decision making where there are standard sorts of examples of this. So for instance, you want to choose a washing powder, you've chosen the best washing powder, but in the supermarket there's a row of identical packets. You have to pick one. There's no reason to choose one or the other. Your choice at this moment is arbitrary. You can pick one, but another one would be equally good. So there, the things you're choosing between are exactly equal. A very different kind of choice is where you don't have enough information to know which one's better or worse. And again, you can just make an arbitrary decision. This is arbitrary in the sense that I take it would be perfectly acceptable to switch that sort of decision for a random process where you tossed a coin and you just, once it came up heads, you picked that one. So that's one way of understanding what to do when reasons give out, what it is to make a judgment. But I take it that's obviously not the right way to think about how the kind of practical judgment Onora's talking about and how we might address moral dilemmas and so on. It's not acceptable or it's not how we would go about trying to resolve a dilemma between honesty and kindness to toss a coin. And more generally, if we're thinking of judgment as something that experts have, that you develop an expertise, it's not the kind of thing that could be replaced with a random process. So that can't be what we mean by judgment. Another thing we might think about it, particularly when we're thinking about these moral dilemmas, is that, okay, the reasons for choosing one that are sort of about the things out there have given out. But what we're doing is making a decision about ourselves. What kind of person am I? Am I the kind of person that values honesty over kindness? And how much more do I value it? I think there's a lot to like about this view, a sort of somewhat existentialist view about decision making. So it explains why this isn't an arbitrary choice, why you couldn't replace it with a random process, why it looks very important and serious when you're saying, well, how honest should I be here? You're deciding what kind of person you are, and that's a big and important decision. It also explains why it's acceptable for different people to make different decisions. We're different people with different personalities. Within a limit of unkindness and dishonesty, there are different choices people can make that reflect a different sort of person. So I think there's a lot to like about this view. But to me, there's something, it doesn't quite feel right about how making these decisions feels. It doesn't feel like I'm deciding who I am. It feels like I'm deciding whether it's right to be, how honest should I be here? What's the right thing to do? So I don't think that can be, and it also I don't think can generalize to all kinds of practical judgment. It makes sense where it does, I think, in these sorts of moral cases, but much less in some other kinds of expert practical judgment. So it won't be a general answer either. So I think another way is to go back to thinking, well, perhaps there are reasons after all. When I said you're trying to get it right, perhaps you are responding to reasons when you make these practical judgments. I don't think that necessarily means there's some general rule you're following. You could have a more, what philosophers have called a particularist view, where in each situation, so there's no necessarily general answer that you should always be honest rather than kind. Each situation has to be looked at. But there is an answer about how honest you should be in that situation. And you're trying to find that. And there are reasons for that. But I think there are two problems for that, for the sort of view that Onora and I both like. One is it becomes less clear then why different people would come up with different answers and why that would be acceptable. Because if there is an answer of how honest you should be here, shouldn't we all be that honest in this situation? So where does the variability in judgment come back? And the second is that a view of reasons that is a lot of people are drawn to is a weighing model of reasons, where you think, well, what have we got most reason to do? And then we should do that thing. And that pushes you towards a view where, again, well, there isn't a lot of opportunity for different judgments being acceptable. One example of this, I think, you see within moral philosophy is between a sort of Kantian view that we have an imperfect duty to give to charity, and there's room for judgment about who you give to and when. And then the line of thought that you see in the contemporary effective altruist saying, well, how much good can you do by different choices when you make to charity? And if there's more good to be done, you have more reason to do that, then you have to do that. There isn't actually room for judgment here. You just do the thing where there's most reason. So I think there are two challenges here for this sort of view. One is to make sense of judgment, and the other is to make sense of practical reason, and how you can have a practical judgment that's reason responsive without moving towards this weighing model, where judgment drops out after all. Okay, thank you very much.
Now we'll hear from Nigel Shadbolt.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today amongst friends and colleagues. The ambition of the Institute for Ethics and AI is perfectly realised in this event. I was fortunate to help configure and set up the Institute, broad and interdisciplinary with its foundations in considered philosophy, but also informed by the accomplishments, progress and ambitions of AI as practiced and researched. And as an AI practitioner now for over 40 years, I want to consider the points Onora so eloquently made, but also to briefly consider how it is that techniques, methods and modes of AI lead us to think about judgment and the rules and models that might underpin categories of judgment. So perhaps start, no bad thing, this stage of the day, to express violent agreement with some of the key points that Onora makes. Indeed, in my very first piece of work on AI, as an undergraduate dissertation written at the University of Newcastle, rather pompously called Considerations on the Artificial Intelligence Paradigm in 1978, I had the good fortune to be under the guidance of Jeff Midgley, one of a remarkable part of a remarkable philosophical duo, argue passionately in support of the role of vagueness and indeterminacy. Jeff had taken me on a trip from Frege, biological positivism, to early and later Wittgenstein, and I became much obsessed with the nature of language games and rule following. And another philosopher who made a similar journey to Wittgenstein was Frederick Weissman, originally an arch verificationalist and a member of the Vienna Circle, who came to talk about the open texture of language. It's a fundamental property of most, though not all, concepts. And it was this texture that prevented us from verifying conclusively many of the empirical statements we make. One of the kind of recognitions that led to the demise of various forms of positivism and verificationism. So, and more to the point, that many of the judgments in philosophy exist around the fault lines that are revealed by this indeterminacy and open texture of language. The fact is that indeterminacy, a kind of contextualism, is everywhere. But the project of AI has sought to make progress in any event, and knowledge representation languages and formal reasoning systems have occupied many decades of AI research, my own included, building classifier systems, judging objects by their characteristics, organizing them into subsumption hierarchies to tell your robins from your sparrows, or 1 gram negative infection from another. Systems for classification, diagnosis, planning, monitoring, situational assessment, a wide range of decision support systems to help us effect judgments. The challenge was always the frame problem, some set of circumstances unforeseen in the original system, some aspect of the world not accounted for, the open texture of that world. And there was also a challenge that I'll return to around a kind of meta-knowledge, a strand of metacognition that we might want to reach for, circumscription, being sure of what it's appropriate to have a judgment about in the first place, or your certainty in a judgment. We now have, relatively recently emerged, very different sorts of AI method, deep neural networks, large assemblies of layer on layer of connected nodes, where the connection weights are adjusted according to various learning regimes that are trained on prodigious amounts of data that produce apparently sensible responses across many domains. Generative Pre-trained Transformer 3, GPT-3, is the current one, originally trained on terabytes of data with 175 billion parameters. Those are essentially the weights in the network model that can be adapted to work in a wide range of tasks. Model took huge amounts of compute time, millions of dollars to produce. It's produced what we now refer to as large language models or foundation models that appear to be adaptable across a wide range of downstream tasks. And one of them recently, GPT Chat, which you can all log on to and have it write part of your essay or whatever. It is a real challenge for Turnitin, let's put it that way, has been commanding much recent attention. And indeed, when I logged on it this morning to have a chat, I asked it what kind of bird is a robin, one of those reflective categories of Kantian judgment. The robin's a small type of small perching bird that commonly is found in woodlands, gardens and parks across the Northern Hemisphere. It's a plump, round body, a reddish-orange breast, a brown back. The robin's a member of the thrush family and its scientific name is Turdus migratorius. Robins are known for their melodic songs and are often considered a symbol of spring. And I can get another one. The American robin is a species of true thrush that is common in North America. Just ask the question again. They're familiar sight in gardens, parks and open woods and are known for their reddish-orange breast and cheerful song. They're migratory birds and are often one of the first birds to return to northern areas in the spring. Third to go, the American robin. Now you're starting to get a sense that there's a bit of geographical specialization in this. Whatever it's been trained on, it has a very particular love for the American robin. And we can see this narrowing of interest in geography. But this is the basis for a kind of reflective judgment that is algorithmically feasible. And that's going to present challenges to us in making assessments of the appropriacy of these judgments. What kinds of judgments are offered by these systems? And that's giving rise to a great deal of concern, whether it's used in settings from biometrics to bail setting. The precondition is a huge amount of data. And our most recent models, and if you think GPT-3 is impressive, wait until Google releases its pathways to a language scaling model, so-called PaLM model, which has been trained on 540 billion parameters. It's producing unreasonably impressive results across jokes, logical inference, writing code from specifications, translating between programming languages and natural languages it hasn't seen much of. The question we reach for here is what kind of models are internalized in these systems, if models they be at all? How are we to account for their behavior? Palm performs current state-of-the-art systems across a number of tasks. We have a wide range of benchmarks that we're using to try and assess. And I think getting our efforts behind what those benchmarks are and whether they are a reasonable assessments of the types of judgment that occupy us is an urgent problem that should occupy interdisciplinary researchers. It also appears that performance follows a log linear behavior. Performance has not yet topped out. It has not yet plateaued. And the current model, 500 billion parameters, when shown 5 examples of solved problems, so-called 5-shot learning, can do better than average performance of people asked to solve the same tasks. So this is sending definitely a frisson through the community. What are we to understand from that? One thing is to ask yourself what sort of data is it trained on? And of course, unfortunately, it's trained on, well, over 50% of the data in the very largest models are from social media conversations. You can imagine what problems might result. Toxicity and bias. And as writers, the researchers themselves observe, we observe high variance in the toxicity probabilities. We note that Islam and Judaism have a higher overall probability of producing toxic responses in the continuation prompt, all X are. And I think the interrogation of the implicit, if you like, value frameworks of these systems also becomes an urgent challenge. There is great indeterminacy about our own confidence around how these systems will perform, and people are very inclined and keen to poke and prod and explore the various limits, and also to understand what kinds and sorts of explanation we might expect from them. Finally, I'd just like to return to a meta consideration. One way to explore judgment is to ask about our confidence in making judgments. Perceptual judgments are quite a nice example of this. Cognitive psychologists, people like Chris Frith, have worked in this area to explore our judgments in areas like perceptual vision, size, constancy, distance, relative motion. We're pretty good at that. We have a pretty strong sense of our confidence in making a judgment in that psychological space. Other judgments, moral, aesthetic, the whole set of issues Alison was referring to, where we might seek convergence for a wide range of purposes, consistency. What we do know is there is intrinsic and variability there, which we may seek to reduce. And associated with this is a significant feature of all decision systems that I've dealt with in building systems in the past. It's the limits of expertise, what the system doesn't know and what it knows about what it doesn't know. And I think this is easy to kind of simply say, this is the kind of Rumsfeldian known unknowns, unknown unknowns. It seems to be a crucial feature of, and something again Alison kind of touched on, the humility of judgment, the ability that we respect judgments when they are clearly both informed but aware of the intrinsic limits of what can be known, is known, or what might not be internalized in the model with a symbolic, sub-symbolic, and neural network or a rule-based system. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nigel. Onora, would you like to take the opportunity to respond?
It's very intriguing. I find that question about the humility of judgment rather crucial. Where do we trust our own judging and other people's judging, and where not? And although I've reached no conclusions, I've started thinking a lot about conspiracy theories, because it seems to me that the non-corrigibility of some beliefs, or indeed we could call them subsystems of beliefs, that are we would characterize as conspiratorial, is a real challenge to how we think about judgment, because it seems that the ordinary systems of corrigibility that our everyday judgments rely on, oh, I didn't know that, oh, I didn't take any account of the following, seem to go missing. And why and what is going on? What is it that simply that people can't find the materials for correcting their judgments because the sources of information are too remote from them? I don't know. I'd be very interested, Nigel, in what you may think about why corrigibility appears to become harder, because on the surface it is bizarre that in the 2020s we seem to have flourishing conspiracy theories in a way that we usedn't quite to have, or not recently.
I mean, just one thought on that. I think the shocking thing, when people work with very large models in modern machine learning context, and particularly the large language models, there's this phrase that's often used, they hallucinate. In fact, they are the most terrifying of plausible bullshitters. And that is to say, they have all of the information to hand, and they will endeavor, I say endeavor, that's they will present a generative response, and it will appear cogent. Being able to unpick what those limit conditions are, that seems to be a really crucial feature. So I think it's well worth thinking about. Yeah.
So one thing I wonder, and I wanted to ask the panel, is whether it matters the source of the judgment. So when I make a judgment as to whether I should be more honest or less, or more kind-hearted or less, I base that judgment partly on my experience. I remember what it's like to lie and how difficult it is to keep a lie and what kind of hurt people might get from it. And in the same way, when I make a decision as to whether to buy one sort of apple or another, I remember the acidity of it, I have like an experience of it. Whereas large language models seem to report on an experience. They can tell you that an apple is sweet, or they can tell you that people get hurt when you're not kind-hearted, but they don't have that experience. So is that kind of experience contingent in the sense that we could have an AI that arrives at the right judgment or at an appropriate judgment without that experience, or is it necessary to have appropriate moral judgments?
I think that corrigibility is one of the things that we might need to look at quite a lot in different sorts of judgment, because if you think about everyday judgments about, that people make when they're interacting in familiar contexts with familiar people about familiar topics. I beg the question by putting familiar in each place. But then they're quite good at corrigibility. Oh no, it wasn't last Wednesday that this happened, because I remember it was raining and it didn't rain on Wednesday, whatever it might be. I feel that there's a sort of failure of corrigibility when we get more ambitious judging. I don't know whether that's something, Nigel, that you would also think, that corrigibility gets much more difficult at a certain point.
Well, I think I'm very fascinated to hear David Neuberger thinks about on these sorts of matters as well, from a serious judging point of view. I think that this issue about do we feel differently if we know the origin, the provenance of the judgment is from well, whatever some people may or may not foolishly believe about the sentience of these large language models. I mean, there is an extreme wing who might argue for that, but the real thought we have is that these systems are not embedded in any sense in the world, both centrally or in any interestingly deep, thick way. I mean, I'm trying to, whatever vocabulary you use there, they simply aren't grounded. And simply giving them some sensors and some wheels isn't going to hack it either. There's this deep sense of the reach for another form of life being pretty important here, and that whole sense of embedding. And I think we do, when we're looking for certain sorts of judgments, it's kind of important to us that the system across from us may be capable and susceptible to the same frailties, fragilities, desires, passions that I am in the dock or whatever. So that I think that must matter, I thought. However, having said that, we rely these devices that augment our capability, that give us decision supporting succor, they can still give us highly convergent and effective support in making judgments by virtue of the fact there is, in some sense, internalized in there, huge amounts of collective opinion and like and preference.
How do you reconcile that with the emergence of conspiratorial judgments in a number of different contexts, where people believe claims that probably do not have quite such widespread support about winning elections that they apparently lost, or about vaccines that they apparently do not believe are protecting people?
I mean, it would be, again, if we simply rely on a particular class of AI artifact to get us over the hump of these discussions, slight danger in these very powerful models that are emerging is that we also know that task-oriented, specific, knowledge-oriented systems turn out to be pretty important. So the systems I have built to classify the lesions in dermatology, or look at ultrasound in development, images and ultrasound images in development, those are those benefit from huge amounts of background knowledge and triangulation and authoritative kind of grounding in the facts of the matter. I think, of course, the danger with very large models that they may well, in a certain sense, the work on this suggests that they can give voice to and find plausible reasons in support of your favorite conspiracy. But that is the fact that we haven't seriously compartmentalized the data sets in terms of their epistemic validity, so to say, and whether that is something we might begin to do or could do or should do is an interesting thought.
Are we ready to open the floor to the audience? Yes, here. I don't know if a mic is coming. Yes, it's coming.
I'll just speak up. Lorraine, you're being brought a box of something.
Yes.
I'll just speak up. It's the question for Alison Hills. My goodness. Okay, right golly. Okay, gosh, a marvel of modern technology. It's a question about the implicit role of the optimum. So implicit in the title of Kahneman et al.'s book, Noise, is the assumption there exists a signal, that there is an optimum answer. And just as between true and false there is a spectrum of degrees of probability, one might argue that between an optimum, if such exists, and the arbitrary, there is also a spectrum of degrees. So to return perhaps to a slight variant on your detergent example, we've all been in selection committees, and often we reach very quickly a judgment as to who are the 4 or 5 finalists. And there's a high degree of convergence in my experience about this. Then, amongst the 5 finalists, we are indeed in a situation, not of entirely of arbitrariness, but certainly a situation where it would be very difficult to argue there exists an optimum choice. There might be an optimal fit for this particular fellowship or position, but it will always be a question of contravening arguments. That seems to me an important distinction that plays a role in many, many areas of judgment, in which the assumption is if there isn't a single correct decision, there is merely caprice.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I was saying I'm very sympathetic to this view that there is variability. I suppose what's needed is perhaps to fill out this picture of what's between the arbitrariness and the weighing sort of optimum maximizing most weights picture of what reasons are doing. So what are we doing when we are making these judgments between these candidates? Are we not trying to get a single correct answer? Are we trying to make a decision about how much weight to put? So perhaps one thing that might be the case is that one of the candidates is stronger along one line, say better research, and one is a better teacher. And so one of the things we're doing is deciding between things where we have a clear answer along one line, but we need to decide how much weight we give them. So if there's no, put the weight thing again, it's very tempting to move back to that model of weighing. But when you have that model of weighing, it's very tempting to think there is an answer, because when you weigh things, they have a weight, and one weighs more than the other, or they're exactly equal. So I think that's exactly what I'm asking for, right? How should we understand it? What is a better metaphor for this? Arbitrary picking is not the right metaphor. Weighing is not the right metaphor. How should we understand it? So what I'm asking from Onora, from people who like me, who like this model, is do some more work to fill out this model so we can understand how we're doing something that's not like both of these things, but it is an exercise of expertise, of judgment. It's not just about yourself. It's about looking at the world. And but tell me more about what it is that you're doing.
I had a question that is trying to put some strain on humility and corrigibility. My example is the use of AI in the evaluation of X-rays and other medical technologies, where a patient doesn't want humility, doesn't want corrigibility. They want to have confidence in the judgment that the evaluation of the X-ray is correct and leads to the correct therapy that saves their lives. A French study of this has indicated that there is some evidence that AI is so good at interpreting X-rays, or is going to be so good, that it will do without the need for a personal physician. My question is about how a patient, what expectations are legitimate for a patient to have about the judgments that go into medical care involving AI. I mean, I guess I come out thinking I want AI to evaluate my X-ray, but I absolutely want a clinician there to override, for one very good reason, which is the studies apparently indicate that AI evaluation of X-rays leads to a lot of false positives. They detect tumors where there aren't any, as it were. I guess I'm asking a question about what, for non-experts, what are the legitimate expectations we have about the use of AI in these cases which involved excruciating forms of judgment on which life and death can actually turn, and where you don't want humility, you want corrigibility, you want the human being to correct and override an AI evaluation of your X-ray, precisely because we can't have perfect confidence that AI will evaluate those X-rays correctly. But clearly this is an unstable situation in that AI is becoming ever more sophisticated. So as a patient, you have some quite excruciating difficulties about knowing who to trust. So there's an issue of trust here that I wondered whether anybody had something to say about.
I think Alison's in the audience. Alison works on image interpretation and I shouldn't. And actually, I'd be fascinated, perhaps, because I mean you'll have very live experience of this before I kind of opine about it. If that's cheeky of me to do that, but I'd quite welcome a.
Shall I try to throw it?
Yeah. Oh wow.
This afternoon with more questions, and I've called it running before we can walk, because one of the things you need to understand, everyone needs to understand, is if the doctor is going to overrule the algorithm's response, how does the doctor know that it is better, that they are better? How do they know that that algorithm is correctly being applied to that instance and actually was trained on that particular circumstance? And I've got some examples of babies in prams to try and explain how difficult it is to develop a model that you can adapt to human in medicine. So hopefully I'll cover it this afternoon, but I really think that we need to be careful about the use of algorithms in medicine.
I mean, I would just say, I think you use a very telling phrase, which is it's quite unstable at the moment. And in fact, isn't so very many, well, it is many years ago, some decades ago in the first heyday of knowledge-based systems. Stanford in particular were running systems and evaluations on this. And their observation was there was huge amounts, I mean, the systems were nothing like as comprehensive or data rich as they are now. But their observation was huge amounts of professional reluctance, as you can imagine, from professional physicians to adopt them. In fact, they came to think that the best way was to change the modality of the system, not to be a decision-making system, but essentially a critiquing system, or a system to try and enjoin the physician to imagine alternative possibilities, so to nudge them around, to get them to flex their judgment space, which I think is a very interesting modality that we'd be well advised to think about in some certain contexts. But to your point, I mean, I think this is right, and again, there'll always be notorious examples of where the absolute apparent precision of and a capability of the X-ray diagnostic algorithm is actually predicated on some entirely second-order feature that is a feature of that particular setup. I mean, that's happened in a number of cases. But I think the challenge is there now, in particular, lesion detection for benign and non-benign dermatological analysis. Clearly, those performance levels are very impressive. But this notion of having the notion that the triple assessment model, that one of the people you'll have in the room in making the assessment is actually the algorithm, but you're not going to be doing away with the specialists who have the circumscription knowledge. They have the knowledge about the limit cases that might end up being crucial. I think that's for that reason alone. But at the front end screening, I can see this, what is already being quite significant.
Hi, my name's Mona. I'm a lawyer, and I'm so interested in the fallibility of it all, because we hold AI to such a high standard, but yet we all know that humans make error judgments, and it's part of our experience, which judgment we end up making. We don't make the same judgment when we're a teenager that we do when we're 80. That is all accepted, and yet AI is expected to get it right all the time. Is that something that we need to shift our perspective and just assume that AI is more of a helpful crutch than something that holds the absolute 100% right answer? Because we all know people don't agree on their judgments. I mean, look at Brexit. Nobody knows what is right or what is wrong. Well, you do, but you see what I mean? I think I know what is right, but you find somebody else who's got a completely different view and won't be shifted from it.
I think it's a lot of different things. I feel some parts of the audience have got thoughts on this.
I'm actually not going to answer that question, so I'm going to throw that one back to the panel. But we were having some merriment about whether we thought our judgment was flawed on Brexit. My question is really to ask what role doubt has in this. And I'm specifically sort of provoked to answer it in relation to conspiracy theories, because actually if you read closely the conspiracy theories, it says, well, they didn't say how many people went blind. They didn't say how many people are infertile. And the answer is none. Yeah, but in creating the doubt, they create the information upon which the conspiracy grows. So I'm particularly interested in how large language systems sort of interpret that sort of behavior, and whether that's part of the toxicity, how you deal with it, really.
I think that's a great and powerful observation. I think humility and doubt, it's kind of some of the virtues you might want to seek to bring out of the systems, or to think about how they might be engineered in. Of course, with things that ingest very, very large amounts of corpora of data, the ability to craft that in a particular way is challenging. So it rather suggests that hybrid architectures, where there is in some sense a marriage of symbolic and sub-symbolic systems, or if you like, a more traditional rules-based characterization, which essentially reminds the kind of inferences being drawn forth of exactly these issues about limit conditions, about if stuff is simply silent, is that something that could be more fully interrogated? So I think there's, again, it's one of the interesting features, I think, of the Institute is thinking about, well, what classes of framework are we going to appeal to make settled judgments here? And too often, I'm afraid, the kind of knee-jerk reaction of some of us in the business is kind of simple-minded utilitarianism, rather than, balancing off difficult kind of trade-offs in a moral space that contains virtues as well as other obligations, for example, to honesty and humility. Yeah. Barry, behind you.
I'm not going to deal with corrigibility and judgment, because I can deal with that when I talk, but I just wonder whether in the end one's concerned with coming to conclusions on the basis of evidence, whereas conspiracy theorists start off with the conclusion and every bit of evidence, it's then bent in order to arrive at the conclusion, and anything that doesn't fit the conclusion is either invented or is somehow bent in order to establish that the conclusion is right. And I mean, we all have prima facie conclusions very early on, but the art of good judgment making is to keep an open mind and look at the evidence and feed it in as unbiased way as one can. And the more conspiracy theorist minded one is, the less open-minded one is, and the more one just adjusts the evidence to arrive at the conclusion you want. And I suspect the reason why there is so much more conspiracy theory around is because of the internet, and people now who want to have and are attracted by conspiracy theories can just find all the stuff they want, and they read that and nothing else.
I wanted to try and get at what some of our anxieties are here, and then ask what some of the possible ways of assuaging them might be in the AI context. So I suppose part of the worry is, yes, humans also make errors, but the really important thing is we can interrogate them as to why they came up with that decision. If it's a medic, why did you do that? We might learn from the mistake. Whereas in the case of decisions which are inscrutable and where we get an outcome, but we can't find the intelligible way it came to that decision, we're stuck. I mean, practical example is that recently there was a trial of a ship going across the Atlantic, and it was insured. It could only be allowed to have this trial if it was insured. It was insured by AXA, who insisted as an insurance company, we don't mind if anything goes awry, but we need a system that tells us intelligibly why it made the decisions that led to things going awry. So it had to have a second-tier architecture to try to give some example. So one is that what's needed, and can AI always ensure that we can do that? And then secondly, and this is mainly for Nigel, he talked about confidence ratings, and it's true. You know, we want to ask people about their confidence in the judgments they make, and the worrying thing, as Onora pointed out, is that the confidence is off the scale in the case of conspiracy theorists, and we think that's a reason to be really suspicious. So we then have to have confidence decisions, not just about our judgment, but about the algorithms we're using. And then the question is there anything in AI that counts as a returned value it could give us of its confidence in the judgment that it produces? Because I think that might also help to assuage some of the anxiety.
Just on the scrutability of decision making, I'm sure that's something that I'd be interested. What is interesting about that, of course, we rapidly get into the whole notion of what counts as an explanation, another rich set of seams of philosophical thought, and aligning that with categories of judgment. So what counts as effective explanations? Fascinated to hear other views on that. The confidence estimators, of course, has been a long-standing kind of one of the holy grails of AI. You know, what can we put around right the way back to certainty factors, various forms of statistical estimators to give you that. And of course, again, in more traditional, if you like, symbolic systems where there is a chain of reasoning, you've got some kind of appeal back. Often it was quite unsatisfactory in some respects. Again, back to this issue of what counts as a plausible explanation. Confidence in the kinds of foundational models that are now being advanced and extensively used is precisely one of the challenge areas. And people, as you can imagine, in particular safety critical applications. I mean, the great thing about classic deductive systems was I could be confident under a very limited set of prescriptions as to the behavior and the results and the qualified decision making that came out of those systems. And that is, in a certain sense, you are appealing in some cases. The fact is that this still seems to do a plausible job of certain classes of planning and generative reasoning. Is the theory in there? Is the generative theory in there? And what is the nature of that? And because famously, somebody said, you know, there have been these big arguments about data is its own best model versus if the best thing you can do with a lot of data is to get a theory. And the tension between those two views is very telling. And being able to express your confidence in the model. And that brings us to another issue. We saw it in the pandemic famously, which is that huge confidence in the inherent properties of the model as a model. But of course, there were, what was it, that phrase that Tristan used, the dark matter out there that is large amounts of which weren't in the model and that had everything to do with how the phenomena played out in the end, or how the, you know, behavior, mixing, all those things. Yeah. So a bit of a evasive answer, I'm afraid. Yeah.
I think that the question of corrigibility is pretty important in all of this. What do we rely on? One can think about this when one's thinking about one's own making of judgments, or of course institutional or collective judgments. And it seems to me that corrigibility is quite difficult, but simpler when you assume a rather limited number of people who are in touch with one another and used to talking to one another, and any gross failure can be picked up and explained between them. But I feel that it has become a great deal more difficult to correct an initial judgment, or indeed a judgment that is in many ways inadequate, when we are relying on extremely long chains of transmission, extremely complex evidence, and where we don't know the provenance of some of the evidence. And of course, we do artificial things in daily life in order to check the provenance. We, for example, expect to take a sort of one from the trade many people here are involved in the academic trade. We expect those who referee articles before they are published to have read in the relevant field, to know the standards of the relevant journal, and so on. Maybe sometimes they don't, but we expect that. This becomes very, very much harder when we have extremely long chains of communication and where often the provenance of a particular claim is not known or not ascertainable, or it's coming from many different sources, and some of them are highly unreliable. So I would put quite a lot of weight on the way in daily life we check sources, we check provenance. Who said it? Old Jim always tells fibs, we say. Well, maybe old Jim does, and maybe old Jane does too, but maybe another one doesn't. And those have no analogue, I think, in some of the very complex matters that are now being commented on.
I just wanted to actually make an observation rather than a raised question, and that's just to say that we talked about noise as a flaw or a feature, and it seems to me that we think of flaws as negative, and that one of the things that we really need to explore or ask ourselves is, what is the value of having the flaw there? Because it seems to me there must be some reason why we are imperfect beings. And it's not just that we're flawed, but there could be some more positive answer to that question that could help us to then...
I think we came to the word flaw because the book that we both started talking about classifies these things as flaws in judgment. But my own contention is it isn't obviously a flaw, it may just be a feature. Why is underdetermination a feature, or why is it a flaw?
No, why is that feature of value? What value does that
Well, I'm a very irritating philosopher. I don't use the word value because of its ambiguities.
Yes, can you hear me okay? Yeah. I wanted to come back to the Brexit moment, which was very, to me, very interesting, and only in a semi-humorous way, because I began to think about AI as a supplement to political judgment, which is not a topic we have today. And then I began to think more about that, and I wanted to pull out two ways in which I think, Nigel, you've alluded to applications of AI, one being evidence-based, kind of the refinement of judgments in those situations, and the other being, at one point you mentioned kind of opening up imaginative possibilities, which interested me greatly too. So these are two quite different potential uses with quite different epistemological status and claim and so on. But I began to think in political terms, you know, we've had the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, we have the ONS producing wonderful, clear statistics for us the last 3 years, and we have the ignoring of the OBR catastrophically under Liz Truss. So, you know, I wonder quite seriously whether AI as a kind of evidential supplement to political decision-making, in the case of Brexit, for example, couldn't be actually quite an interesting and useful step, although I'm skeptical of strong epistemological claims. But I also thought, in light of governments that lack imagination about urgently needed policy areas, that the alternative, the idea of opening up imaginative possibilities, is also an interesting idea of the application in political domains.
I think that's a good point. I think that is true. It kind of relates back to this issue of noise. That there is a line of work that says having a degree of indeterminacy or noise in the system gives you a latitude for variability to discover better solutions than you might be locally in at the moment. So there is this notion of kind of bumping systems into exploring more of a solution space. The issue of evidence, but well, you know, if I had a pound for every time I've heard people kind of claim that we want our kind of politics to be evidence-based, they want it until they are in the inconvenient position of being in power. It seems to me then a different set of preferences manifest very quickly. And I think that AI being recruited to help, I mean, we see good examples of this in areas like the attempts to do it in the health service or in logistics, transportation. There are clearly areas where, and this relates back again to this issue of what standard do we hold our systems to? And there is, you say, is it unreasonable to expect our machines to be performing at levels in advance of where human performance is? Well, we're delighted when it's an autopilot, and we kind of know what the evidence tells us around various forms of accident induced by human error. And those trade-offs are ones that, even with that evidence, we feel, and people will argue for very different reasons, that they want the driver in the cabin or whatever. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so we started and have hit on this idea of noise being a flaw in the flaw in human judgment. But it's not clear to me that the presupposition that noise is not present in AI judgment, that's true. I mean, Sir Nigel just talked about how interacting with these like GPT-3, that you get a different response every time. So I just wonder what we think about that presupposition. Of course, we might constrain an AI model to give us only the same answer every time, given the same input, but then we might lose some of its power or some of its other virtues. So I just wondered what we might think of that purported contrast.
I don't think noise is always a problem. That is the oddity, to my mind, of Kahneman et al.'s claim that they think that it is a flaw. That is their central contention about noise, that it is a flaw. I think, A, it may be inevitable, and B, it isn't always a flaw. It can make a huge difference to have a response to something that is, let us say, within the upper quartile as opposed to the bottom quartile, and that's a lot achieved. Why does it seem to them a flaw? And I think one of the reasons was that they were very startled to discover how extreme the variability of judgment of some quite ordinary matters appeared to be in certain cases. So I would contend that the idea that it's a flaw has not been established. It may be some advantage to us that we're not aiming to do everything with entire precision, because it may be that entire precision will be bogus precision.
Well, just to say that I think the interesting thing about generative models is that they will give you a different answer each time. One of the interesting things then speaks to Alison's comments around sometimes it's about coordination or convergence, and the summation of a number of interrogations will give you a richer or an interesting palette to discriminate against. And I think, again, that's quite an interesting feature of these systems. Understanding how you systematically exploit that is the challenge.
I don't have much to add to that. Yes, I think there, as I was saying, there's a question about reliability. There's also a question about practical reasons for needing convergence. And I think that will differ in different fields and be stronger in some fields than others. So it very much depends on what you want it for.
Please join me in thanking our panel. This was fantastic.